BfA isn't as bad as people say. This is MultimediaJay Radio Style for Monday, October 7th, 2019. Let's start the show.
MultimediaJay Radio Style.
It's a great day for radio style. Yeah, I'm recording this right as S-Fan's going live with his stream on Twitch, so a little parody is in order here. But yeah, it's a great day to do some podcasting and catch up on a few things related to World of Warcraft. Specifically, Modern WoW, since I actually haven't played Classic on a regular basis in weeks. Oh, there you go. You just went back to retail. You're a noob, blah, 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 or whatever the insults are going to be. But the fact remains, I've already had my Classic experience. I played the original game. So it's more a nostalgia thing and just trying it again for the first time in years. But I've seen everything in that game before. As opposed to BfA, and I have until later this month to play through everything I want to play through before I have to decide if I want to stay subscribed to this game or not. Because ESO, still waiting for me. If I want to go do some ESO stuff, there's plenty of ESO stuff to do. Heck, I can even make some gaming videos about how ESO offers more player freedom than World of Warcraft these days. So, decisions, but what needs to be done in terms of experiencing what I paid for is playing through BfA, at least the story part, on both factions. And I have characters ready to go through both of those stories, if I can stop getting distracted by ideas for alts along the way, and transmogs and all the stuff that I haven't done in the last 3 years. I've been thinking a lot about the criticism of Battle for Azeroth, and what the talking heads have been saying, particularly the more opinionated talking heads like Heal versus Babyface, who seem bound and determined to believe that there is absolutely nothing that modern WoW can get right, when that is far from the truth. As a matter of fact, the credibility of channels like Heals vs. Babyface can easily be called into question if you take a look at some of the stuff they were saying before the expansion launched. I'll give you one example, although taking this topic on would basically require its own podcast as well as a companion blog entry to host the video with timestamps that I'm responding to. One of the things that Az said in his what Battle for Azeroth needs to get right and what it needs to get rid of, blah, 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 what Az said back before the expansion launched was that one of the things that he would like to see in BfA is a version of the class Order Hall storyline, which he thought was very good. But he knew from Blizzard's own official feedback that the Order Halls were unfeasible to continue into future expansions because you would need to have a story and all of that work associated with it for every single class in the game. And if people were only playing a couple of classes, they weren't going to see a lot of the hard work that was put into those stories. So one of the ideas that Az was tossing around at the time was have something like that, but only for your faction, Alliance or Horde. Now, if you've played BfA, you know that Order Hall faction story does exist. It's called the War Campaign, and it has similar levels of storytelling, and it runs the same as the Order Halls, but it's only faction specific. It's only for your faction. It's only Alliance and Horde with the various campaigns through Kultiris and Zandalar. So Blizzard delivered exactly what Heal vs. Babyface wanted. Now, is he ever going to give Blizzard credit for that? Let's sit back and watch, but don't get too worried about it. I don't think it's going to happen. And that really sums up the public's response to BfA to begin with. There's a little something that we've talked about in these podcasts before, a while back actually, maybe to the tune of years, and that is metagaming. Metagaming, to recap, is when you experience a video game and your experience is largely influenced by stuff from outside the game. You don't let the game express itself properly, and you don't let yourself be properly entertained by it because your views are always biased based on what things like, reviewers and other articles and people on YouTube and whatnot are saying. In other words, you never really get a chance to have a proper experience with a game that you're playing because your experience is always biased by stuff from outside the game. And it's a great way to stress yourself out over nothing if you're obsessed with things like 100% completion or min-maxing or something along those lines, instead of let's just sit back and enjoy the story that this entertainment medium is telling, and then maybe go back later for achievements or something along those lines. With Battle for Azeroth, it's trendy to hate this expansion, even if you don't know the reason why, just because somebody else told you it was bad. It's tempting to not give the story a chance because of what people have been saying about the expansion, and basically never give the game a chance to actually do anything good. When in reality, even if BfA is the new Warlords of Draenor, Warlords of Draenor in its time was known for having a wonderful leveling up experience. It was the time gating and the Apexis dailies and all the stuff that artificially kept you playing the game later on that annoyed people, as well as the lack of major patches, cut content, and the, once again, after so many expansions, people were getting sick of it, the roughly year-long new content drought at the end of the expansion. Of course, if you are still annoyed by something that Blizzard hasn't been able to fix since Lich King at this point, that's on you. I mean, there's plenty of other games that you could be playing, or you could roll an alt or something in those content droughts if they keep on happening. This is a risk that Blizzard chooses to take, that people may walk away during a content drought and then just never feel like coming back to the game. But it's all on them. It's not anything that should be driving you nuts. But don't tell that to the people that are just hating BfA because it's trendy to hate BfA. Never mind what happened in patch 8.2, never mind what's happened since, never mind what Blizzard may be getting ready to announce for 8.3 or what the next expansion's going to be. Never mind any good news whatsoever. There can be no such thing as good news with Battle for Azeroth, and flag nabbit, this game is always going to be terrible. There are people out there that are bound and determined to never see anything good with BfA, just as there are those WoW refugees in ESO and Final Fantasy who are bound and determined to not see anything wrong with the game that they left World of Warcraft for, like we discussed earlier. It's a simple matter, really. The sale on BfA, as I record this, has been extended into late October now. So I think to some extent, Blizzard is self-aware of their need to improve things with this MMO versus its competition. And all eyes are on whatever announcement's going to come up for 8.3 and whatever's going to come up at BlizzCon to see whether or not Blizzard might finally be getting a bit of a clue that they have to get with the times on things, that the model that made them successful up until Lich King is long dead at this point, and MMOs are doing very different things these days and finding success in other ways, such that even modern WoW is behind the 8 ball. Forget classic feeling like an old MMO. Modern WoW can feel like an old MMO too, with some of the details and some of the restrictions that are still present in the game that you don't see in other games these days, which do exist, whereas previously they didn't. Now, for the balance of this discussion, I want to talk about some of the specific criticisms of BfA and why they specifically are just fabricating things to hate this game about and not anything too concrete. Let's begin with Blizzard's over-reliance on RNG for loot and stuff like that. So I've had some quest rewards randomly upgrade by a few item levels, or upgrade into blues or purples or something. But one of the main criticisms is that this random number stuff that goes on with drops and raids basically eliminates the ability for there to really be a best-in-slot, because you can get the best-in-slot item, but now you have to factor in like the best-in-slot plus Titan Forge and things along those lines. Well, for one thing, RNG has been part of loot in World of Warcraft since the very beginning. And for a very recent example of this, check out Asmongold's stream and his never-ending frustration, or one of those YouTube channels that aggregates highlights from his streams. And check out his never-ending frustration over the chromatic carapace out of UBRS. He's been running that dungeon since Classic launched, and it's still not dropping for him. That's RNG. So the only thing that has really changed from the earlier versions of the game to what we have today is the launch of personal loot, and raids are smaller, so it improves the odds of you getting something. But what's happened is the shift has moved away from whether or not you get stuff to how good it is. Do you get the normal version of the reward, or do you get the Titan Forged version of the reward? But there's always been RNG and loot drops. Just ask anybody or go listen to some really old strategy guide for an old raid in Burning Crusade or something like that, where somebody's like, the loot table includes this item, but it never, ever, ever drops. Ever, ever, ever. The drop rate is absolutely abysmal on this specific piece of loot. It's only through a couple of item levels that we see this whole thing really fall to pieces about, oh, RNG has ruined the loot tables. Not really. RNG has always been part of getting loot in this game. How RNG affects things is what has changed. And the new system with personal loot and more opportunities to make up for bad luck via tokens and other stuff like that, and other ways to get gear besides raids and things along those lines, help to lessen, soften the blow, so to speak, of not being good with dice rolls in raids and stuff along those lines. There's also the criticism of Titan Forging ruining best in slot, and basically you have no real solid things to shoot for when it comes to gear in order to raid in higher tiers. But that assumes that best in slot is something that had any real positive effect in the first place. When I think of pre-raid BIS and things along those lines, it really turned into something negative. It takes all of the strategy out of things. It's basically just as bad as min-maxing your talent builds. So, okay, you're not a serious raider if you have this equipped instead of that, because that gives you 5 more points in insert stat here. And I think really Blizzard is probably not a big fan of go to some external website, get your BIS list, and then head around grinding the heck out of dungeons until that one thing finally drops, even if there are several other things you could probably equip that would get you through the raids just as well. And we'll see that in Classic too, when we see, for example, warriors wanting to wear leather because they're DPS warriors. So they're fighting rogues for gear because leather still has strength on it, and rogues still make use of strength in Classic because agility only affects your critical hit rate, not necessarily how hard you hit with melee weapons. So in Classic, rogues are still interested in strength. So there's strength on leather, and there's itemization clashes between rogues and DPS warriors, depending on how one-dimensional someone's raid role is. And it's funny because these leather warriors being like, BIS leather, are actually something new that exists in Classic. I remember actually knowing a warrior back in Burning Crusade who wore leather instead of plate, because they never, ever, ever wanted to be asked to tank anything. They hated tanking so much, and they were sick and tired of warriors being the most favored tank in the game, that they deliberately geared out in leather and said, I'm DPS, do not ever ask me to tank. I actually brought that up to some people in-game on the forums, etc., and they thought it was really, really weird that a warrior would gear out in leather because they hated tanking so much. So these kinds of things that people are doing nowadays, when we've metagamed the heck out of the old game and whatnot, and we have BIS lists for everything under the sun, a lot of this didn't exist when these games were current content. So there's a couple of anachronisms that you'll run into with this sort of thing, but really, what this shows is the shortcomings of this whole best in slot thing in the first place. Oh, if you don't have this, we're not going to take you seriously, even though what you do have is close enough that we could probably still down the bosses. Yeah, so in the case of Asmongold, tearing the heck out of UBRS to try and get that chromatic carapace for the chromatic breastplate that he wants crafted by that NPC out in the Plaguelands. So how much longer is he going to go nuts? I mean, is he going to get to the point where the next phase of Classic launches and we move beyond Molten Core into Blackwing Lair and whatnot, or before he finally gets it? But hey, between the old school RNG on whether or not the boss ever drops that piece of gear you're looking for, and no mechanics to get around that if you have bad luck with loot rolls, and the whole flawed philosophy of best in slot in the first place, there's plenty of frustration to go around on his streams, and I wouldn't be surprised if... Is he online right now? Let me double check. S-Fan is. I don't see Asmongold. I wonder if him and McConnell are quietly leveling those horde alts they said they were going to level off stream. So that whole thing with Herod yesterday would have been a rather grand excuse to get away from the never-ending frustrations that they were dealing with on the stream. That's just my guess anyways. It could be they just take a day off on Sunday or something like that. But yeah, it's just kind of pokes some holes in the talking points that people have against BfA nowadays. But the real issue here is to learn for yourself. The game is discounted right now as I record this. Check the game out at a discount, and that way, if it is as bad as you think it is, and it probably isn't, then you at least won't have to deal with the guilt of having paid full price for something that disappointed you. Now let's talk about world difficulty, which is something even I've criticized Modern WoW for, because if you compare Modern WoW to Classic WoW, there's definitely less difficulty. That's not to say that later in the game, it stays that way. I feel like BfA is a little on the easy side because it takes several monsters beating you up at the same time for your health to start taking drastic drops, so to speak. But there's something that I wasn't saying earlier. Since Cataclysm, if I play a character that can tank, I usually level up as a tank, because the outdoor world monsters are not going to do all that much damage, or it's not going to take as much time to kill them as, say, an elite in a dungeon where you want some DPS backing you up. So, if you don't mind things being a little slower, leveling as a tank is an easy way to get to max level with very little downtime nowadays, now that some of the key issues with tanks have been resolved across the board. It'll be slower than leveling as DPS, but you won't have to worry about your health taking big hits like you would with DPS. And that's something that I've run into with Retribution and whatnot. Trying to level as Retribution, which was basically the way to level in the earlier parts of the game, when I switch from Protection Paladin to Retribution Paladin, I start noticing very quickly that I'm taking more damage and have to worry about healing more often with the limited secondary heals of leveling as Retribution. And yet, if I switch to Holy and go Shockadin on everything, I still take the hits, but at least I have more resources to heal with to stay at full health. Whereas with Protection, my guy's just tough enough to just beat up everything that comes running at him, even if he pulls a couple of adds. This is not a BfA thing. This is not a Legion thing. This is not even a Warlords of Draenor or Mists of Pandaria thing. The uptick in outdoor world difficulty came with Cataclysm once upon a time. And so when you were going through the Cataclysm zones, you would notice that a lot of the monsters that were attacking you had things that needed to be interrupted, or they had higher health, or they had more, there was more of a sense of danger when you were leveling through the Cataclysm zones. It was a move away from the AE grindfest that was Wrath of the Lich King, both in and outside of the dungeons. So to bring some challenge back to the leveling experience, Cataclysm ramped things up a bit. And I very much remember, if your character had a tank spec, no matter how slow it made you, you wanted to level as a tank. Because that way, if you accidentally pulled an extra mob or something like that, then it wouldn't be as much of an issue as if you were DPS and basically trying to burn down the mobs before they burned you down, so to speak. And this is with a DPS that can do secondary healing. Makes me wonder what it's like to level as certain kinds of rogues in these kinds of environments. But I think that would just swap out the healing with more crowd control and other ways to stay in command of the fight, so to speak. But some of the difficulty or lack thereof that I've been experiencing through BfA and also earlier in the game with some of the alts that I've been leveling has been the result of leveling as a tank. Change some of the fine details and things become notably more difficult rather quickly in terms of how much damage you take. But I still think the world in general could be a little bit more difficult. But the lesson to be learned here is, if someone's saying BfA is too easy and that there's no real danger in the world, find out what they're leveling as. Does it have a lot of secondary healing, or is it tough right off the bat like the tanks are? So, and then ask yourself, or does it have a pet or something, and you can heal the pet like with a hunter or something, and not have to worry about taking too much damage yourself, because Men Pet is something hunters can cast a lot more than Exhilaration, which is their self-heal nowadays, for those of you who've been out of the loop with Modern WoW over the last several expansions. Ultimately, though, even if BfA goes down the same path as Warlords of Draenor, that basically means time is going to heal these wounds, just like it did with Warlords. I recently took my Death Knight out to Warlords, and with full heirlooms, the opening scenario and setting up the garrison got him up to level 92, with the level range going up to level 100. But the big thing I'm noticing is that there's probably enough of an experience boost with the heirlooms to mostly experience Warlords of Draenor on alts as a zone set that I level through, and not so much the stuff that annoyed people after they got to max level in the original game. So, all the best parts of Warlords of Draenor are going to constitute, aka the leveling experience, are going to constitute the bulk of the experience with Warlords for people that didn't play the expansion when it was current. I'm just curious how many people we start to have out there that hear all these older WoW players talking about, oh, Warlords was terrible, and they don't have any idea what they're talking about because they've only experienced Warlords in the leveling curve to go to something else, and not necessarily what the actual problems were with that expansion when it was current. This kind of stuff that we've been talking about here is stuff that I am completely and totally open-minded to. The question is, how many other people out there are open-minded to it as well, and are willing to give BfA a chance? And of course, if BfA blows it, then they just go somewhere else, instead of making this big to-do about this game, when in reality a lot of the hoopla about World of Warcraft these days comes from people that just want to complain all the time, and not actually try to better their situation, even if it means playing other games, or, as I've been saying all along, keeping a proper perspective on things. Because I'm seeing over and over again that when it comes to dealing with so-called bad expansions like BfA and Warlords of Draenor nowadays, perspective is everything. Thanks for listening, everybody. This is MultimediaJay, signing off. Thanks for stopping by.